Among the top 15 most rapidly densifying cities, Singapore can be considered an acute urban archipelago. We have chosen to look more closely at the density that exists in this specific city. Singapore's current population is 5.7 million over 280 square miles. So what happens as cities densify in the 21st century? As density increases, the historical urban model would push further out in the X and Y direction. But what happens when these are at capacity? Cities are being saturated in both directions and are being forced to look to new channels for a solution. Currently facing this dilemma, Singapore has begun to engage the Z-axis as a way of embracing density. In utilizing vertical circuitry, buildings which already exist become essential. So, what does this change about how we understand cities? What happens when you reframe your understanding of ground? And what are the architectural and cultural implications in doing so?
In building upward and engaging the Z, the existing begins to act as another ground from which spaces are excavated. In the context of this course, we have become familiar with these qualities as latent space objects, or highly interiorized vertical spaces, a concept in which we've also referred to as interiority. We found these to be prevalent across Singaporean architecture, specifically in HDB public housing. Space objects occur naturally with the help of architectural decisions and the existing environment surrounding. For example, vertical pressurization is an existing typology for housing, and we found the frequency of this precise subtraction to be a characteristic of latent space objects native to Singapore. For our space object, we chose to activate the southeast-facing corners in order to mimic the language of the HDBs and maintain involuted pressure.
The first Shangri-La of the brand, located in Singapore, has a major courtyard in the gardenway with a gigantic rock in the middle. This is one example of a kind of ground moving through space. This ground shares language with the filleted balconies, which lean in conversation with the space itself. In a city with limited natural topography, the built environment acts as visual contour and points of rigidity, but it could also have geological and architectural potential if reframed as embedded underneath a new ground which has no defined grade. The potential for interiorized pressure would be, in theory, limited only by the constraints of modern design.
When looking at GMT, we found that it is already redefining ground by having the building on top of a 5-story parking garage essentially acting as a pedestal for new ground. This is then reinforced by the subterranean atmosphere in the initial public space when you enter at floor 2. Because of the existing impervious conditions along with the lack of space in the X or Y direction, Golden Mile Tower is poised not just for upward pressurization, but could also become a model for the new ground and the Z. We propose an intervention which establishes a destination on top of the existing, triggering a capillary action that moves people upwards to both private spaces and public flex spaces. This is considered a new ground level, the entry of which is no longer at grade, but rather at ground. Building off the idea of new ground potentials, we choose to use GMT as a transformation of ground for the soon-to-be renovated GMC. We envision implementing temporary housing as a case study for the dynamic population growth that this new ground could accommodate. We have incorporated a hawker center as one of the ongoing public services, which would act as a trigger of capillary action of residents and non-residents, and infuse the addition with one specific aspect of Singaporean culture. By pressurizing upwards, we hope to absorb a multi-layered program for existing population and transient ones. We suggest that one can envision the built fabric as a new kind of ground by displacing the grade. By adding both public and private areas on top, we are accommodating the temporary need for the population today while also anticipating future growth. By incorporating flexibility for quality of life, we have programmed in an emphasis on the community building by designing for a highly interiorized vertical spaces. Ultimately, we have built upon concepts that already exist in Singapore and used them to perpetuate the narrative of figure and ground and include proactive design for density.
The lush surrounding natural world is an indigenous part of Singapore's culture that has also become a part of the spectacle of tourism in the late 21st century. The merging of ground and built environment is a symptom of density, but has also become a point of attraction that celebrates the urbanism and tourism embedded into the culture today. This aspect of Singapore sets it apart from other cities, and our goal is to amplify this. We ask the question of whether the continued blurring of figure and ground embraces this spectacle or mythology that is rooted in indigenous culture. Our goal is not to assume that this is a problem that needs to be solved, but rather to investigate whether this is an attribute of the city that can be heightened to better understand the idea of a new ground and how we may use it as an architectural tool.